I think we will say welcome everyone to this evening where we have the great pleasure of having Judith Sedgeman with us. And we're really delighted because we're having this series where we are inviting people who actually knew Sid, who studied directly under him. And so
Uh-huh.
we're really excited to have you. We've had Bill, we've had Elsie, we're going to have Dickon.
Uh-huh.
We're, we want to have a lot of the original students of SIDS to hear more about who he was and what touched you specifically, because a lot of the people, as I wrote you in the email, a lot of people here are brand new to the principles, and they meet the principles mainly through some of the Danish speakers. So to hear about where does this come from,
Yeah.
and what was it, because you had a career already in psychology. What was it that attracted you to sit, and what touched you so that you changed your life, and this is what you've been doing now for a long time? That's what we'd
Yeah,
love
it's been
to
nearly 40 years. So
hear.
I already, yeah, actually, I didn't have a career in psychology. I had a career in business. And when I met Sid, I was the CEO of a fairly substantial medical practice management company. And I never expected, I would, if you had said, "Are you ever going to get involved in psychology?" I would say, "No, I've hated psychology in college." I took one course and I said, "Ooh," it was all about weird stuff. So I actually ended up with Bill Pettit was my first client, was my first contact in the three principles, and because he became a client of my company because he was a doctor. So I met Bill Pettit as a doctor who was looking for practice management services, and was introduced by a mutual friend who said, and at that time I was very, very stressed out. And the business was, I don't know if any of you are doctors or work with doctors, but it's not easy because number one, they have an incredible busy schedules, and if you want to get anything done, you're meeting at all hours of the day and night. There's no predictability in it, and they're very demanding, and they're curt, and they don't really care about business, but they do care about the bottom line, and they want to know that you've delivered, but they often don't want to participate in the process. So it was a very frustrating business for me at that time, and I was thinking of getting out of it. I was thinking of selling it and just doing something else, but I toyed with the idea, but I had all these I had 5-year contracts, so I couldn't plan to get out tomorrow. You just don't abandon people. So I was pretty, when I met Bill, I'd say he may have noticed that I was stressed. So anyway, what I noticed about him was that he wasn't, and he was on staff at 4 hospitals. He had a ton of patients. He had a solo practice. He had 3 counselors working for him. So he had, and a staff, I think about 4 people on his staff. And and he had 3 children, and his wife was pregnant with their 4th child. So um, I mean, under normal life circumstances, you'd look at somebody like that who was also having serious financial problems because nobody understood how to bill psychiatric services. For those of you who have national health care, this may seem very strange, but unfortunately here you have to almost be a magician to get money from an insurance company. And so so he had a lot of receivables, but not too much revenue flow. Uh, so he needed help, and he was driving this old rusty car. That's the one thing I'll never forget, is that he's the only doctor I ever met who was driving an old rusty car at his point in life. And so when I met him, I thought, well, this is when we pulled into the driveway and I saw, how busy his practice was, and I saw the car parked in the back in the doctor's space, and I thought, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And I expected him to be tense and, stressed and upset with all that's going on and no money and all this stuff. And he was happy as a clam. He just came in with a big grin and he said, "Yeah, I'm really happy. I heard a lot about you. I understand you do great work for doctors. So yeah, let's get going." And he was very confident that we would solve his problems and everything would be fine. and he wasn't worried about it, and he had better things to do. And I was struck by his just the feeling of him of confidence and calm in the midst of all this chaos going on. And he also had a tremendous number of patients. And I'll get to Sid because this is leading in that direction. He had a tremendous number of patients, which is very unusual. Here again, I don't know if this is true worldwide, but in the United States, most psychiatrists have a fairly small patient base, and they see the same people for years and years and years. So, and he had 10 times as many files as any other psychiatrist that we knew in my business. And he'd only been in town for 18 months. So I'm thinking, like, he can't possibly be seeing this many people, even with 4 counselors working for him. That's not a possibility, you know. And I remember at one point I was just looking around the office, kind of assessing what was, you know, how to start. And I said, you know, I don't want to be rude, but you have an awful lot of files for a psychiatrist. I said, you know, where are all these people? And he said, I guess they're having a nice life. And when he said that, it really rocked my world. And I think you'd have to realize that having a nice life is something children do, you know, in the world of business people that I, you know, in the sort of Chamber of Commerce world that I lived in, you know, children have nice lives, and then you got to get serious about life and get to be an adult and start working your butt off. And your nice life comes to a squeaking halt. Plus, I never heard of anybody speak of people who were mentally ill having a nice life. You know, all the psychiatrists that I knew, and there were 8 other psychiatrists that I knew very well, you know, would say things like, well, you know, I'd say, how are your patients? How do they do, you know, after you've seen them for a while? Well, you know, they're managing their disease, they're managing their problem, you know, they're on drugs. We've got the cocktail now of medications. And or, well, you know, he hasn't had a drink for 6 months, and there's hope that he might stay sober. And you know, if he can just get a job, and we're hoping for that, and things like that, you know, very modest goals, having nothing to do with the quality of their life and having to do with the management of their mental illness. And Bill talked about mental illness as though it was the common cold. You know, it was like, yeah, now they're over it, they're having a nice life. And I was like, I had never ever, and again, I wasn't in the mental health field, but I had never heard of such a thing. I had never heard of anybody talk about mental illness like it was no big deal. And it came and went, and people got over it. And when they got over it, they had a nice life. So I was stunned. And I started to worry a little bit that maybe he was a kook. I really did. I mean, I was thinking, like, wow, this is so outside of the box of things, you know, from the business standpoint that I know about. But I liked him because he was very pleasant. He looked like he'd be easy to work with. And it was a challenging practice to take on because of the situation. And I was always up for a challenge. So, but he could see that I was really surprised by what he said. And our mutual friend, the person who introduced me to Bill, he turned to him and he said, oh, I don't think you told her that I don't actually do psychiatry the same way other people do. And our friend said, no, I figured I'd let her come across it on her own. And they were laughing. And I said, okay, so what do you do? And he said, you know, probably anybody that's been around Bill has heard him say it 1,000 times that he spent 27 years learning how to be a mental illness professional, even though they call it mental health. And until he met Sydney Banks, he never knew what mental health was. And so that's what he said to me. He said, I'm actually not a mental illness specialist. I know a lot about it because I've been to school, but he said, I specialize in mental health, and I teach people about their mental health. And I said, well, if they're mentally ill, I mean, what mental health? And then he said, well, you know, you're asking good question. And he said, people get confused by when our patients get well and go home, and and when there's mental illness in a family, the whole family organizes around the mentally ill person usually, um, because they're the they are the problem. They're the sort of the fulcrum that drives the whole thing. And so if they come home and they're having a nice life all of a sudden, they're mentally well, sometimes the family dynamic is very uncomfortable and people don't know what to make of it. And often because of the prevailing views at that time, that mental illness was a lifetime. It was like a heart defect. Once you had it, you were stuck with it. It was like a defect. Um, so Bill said to me, there I do a group for the families and friends of my patients who get well, because they need to understand that these people are going to be fine, and everybody's fine and they're fine too, and they don't need to be worried. And he said it's a regular group. It was in a meeting room that was in the big medical complex where all of our offices were. And he said, it's over there, and you can come, and if you'd like to sit in, that'd be fine. So I thought, I better do that, because if I'm going to be representing this practice, I used to go watch my surgeons do surgery, and I kind of wanted to know what my clients were up to, and how good they were, and how their patients treated them, and so on, and vice versa. So I went, and he saw me come in, and he stopped the introduction of the group and said, "Oh," he said, "Judy Sedgeman just walked in. She is a specialist in practice management, and she's going to be working with our practice. Her company is going to be working with our practice. And we'd like to have her understand that when I tell people that my patients are having a nice life, that I really mean it. So if there's any of you patients here who would like to share with Judy what your experience was, she'll stay around during the break and a little bit afterwards, and you can talk to her." And I was stunned. And I don't know whether, again, this may not, every culture is different, but this would not happen in the United States of America. It's just not a doctor who had the humility to say, "I'm entrusting, information about my practice to my recent patients. And I will let a total stranger, you can talk to a total stranger, and I trust everything is going to work out." I mean, that just never happens. And I was like, this is some other universe I'm in here. I was really shocked. And then I thought, well, that's a nice gesture, but nobody's going to want to talk to me. What mental patient is going to want to talk to me, So, but I hung around, and 10 people lined up to talk to me. So, and I won't go into all of that because this is not about that, but essentially, to a person, the only book at that time that was out, and it was just recently out, was Second Chance. Its first book, Second Chance. And every single patient that I spoke to, Bill's patients, said, he gave me this little book to read, and I really liked that book. It was very helpful. And I'd say, "Why?" And they'd say, "Well, I don't know. I mean, they weren't very specific about it, but I remember one person said, I just was reading the book and I kind of got into it." And she was in the hospital at the time, and she said, "I didn't have anything to do and it was bedtime. So I was reading the book, right before I went to sleep. And I set it down." And she said, "When I put my head down on the pillow to sleep, she had been agoraphobic. She said, I suddenly had the insight, I scare myself to death with my own thoughts. That's ridiculous." And she said, that was kind of the beginning for me. Now, this woman had been agoraphobic for 25 years. She hadn't left her house. She was in her 50s, and she had had her first psychotic break when she was in her 20s. And now she's in a group sharing with a stranger about her experience 6 weeks ago that changed her life. And I'm like, oh no, this doesn't happen, But it was obvious that she was real. I mean, they weren't actors, they were real patients. So that's how these stories were. They were so simple. People would say, "Yeah, well, he didn't do that much, but I really liked this little book." And then he talked to me so respectfully. That was the other thing they all said. He didn't talk to me like I was crazy. And people with a lot of experience in mental health treatment are used to being spoken to very disrespectfully by their caregivers. Um, and they started having the idea that, you know, he doesn't seem to think I'm crazy. Well, that's really, if you want to say what is the secret sauce that Sid Banks brought to the table for all of us, is that nobody's crazy. Nobody's crazy. They're crazy is a thought. It's a set of thoughts that people have themselves. But and Sid talked to everybody in the world exactly the same way. It doesn't matter what condition they were in, or what their story was, or what their situation was, or whether they were the king of something or a street beggar. He spoke to people in the same tone, with the same level of respect and the same regard for their humanity, and the same respect for their dignity. And, you know, I don't know that people realize what a powerful thing that is. I don't know that people realize that is a powerful, powerful thing, because what it does is it erases the one up, one down relationship. You know, if you go to an expert who then gives you a label and says, you know, you've got this mental illness or that problem, and this is how I'm going to treat you, and this is what I'm going to do for you, and this is what the system can provide for you, you become like a ward of the state. You know, you lose power. You're now you're being treated for something you can't even pronounce or spell, in a setting that you've never been in before, with people that you don't know who are talking about you in front of you, and it erases any sense of agency. You know, it's sort of like, I you know, as a mother, I kind of relate it to having a baby. You know, once you get in the delivery room, you're just not in charge. Nobody cares what you think, you know. And but that's a short-lived and generally pleasant experience, whereas mental illness is neither. And Sid had I mean, he didn't know anything about mental illness when he had his experience, but he had an immediate understanding that nobody's different. That came from his. Now, that isn't what he would say was one of the discoveries that he made, but the net result was Sydney Banks' human being was just like every other human being on the planet, and every other human being on the planet was just a human being. And what all human beings have in common is they're making it up. And whatever they make up looks real to them until they make up something else. And when they make up something else, their whole life changes. And that's a power, that's a spiritual power, that's a spiritual gift. And it is nothing special, because we all have it. Like, there's no special people. And I think that was, in a sense, you know, that sounds so simple and almost childlike, but honestly, that's what's revolutionary about the three principles, is that it completely erases hierarchical relationships in humanity. There's no special people. There's no people that, you know, it embarrasses me. One of the reasons I just recently wrote a book, and one of the reasons I did it, is I was at a conference 2 years ago when we were still traveling in London, and I was one of the elders, you know, which I guess that's my age, it's true. And so having just had my 78th birthday, I have to admit, okay, I'm one of the elders, what can I say? But and people treated us as though we were some you know, special breed of person, you know, like the pioneers, and there was nothing special about it. We just, you know, we were just lucky, and we got old, you know, being lucky. Now we're elders, you know, what can you say? But it doesn't make us anything, it doesn't make us any better than anybody. And and I appreciated the respect and everything that people showed, but I felt it was a little, well, I got a little freaked out when somebody came and asked me for my autograph. And I said, oh no, I can't do that. And she said, oh no, she said, I'm so impressed. I loved your talk, and I'm a big fan, and I've watched all your YouTube videos, and I've been reading your blog for years. And I just would, and I said, no, you don't want my autograph. It's not about me. I said, if you've been getting anything out of what you've been doing, it's not me, it's you. It's because something happened to you while you were looking at it or reading it, that there was something there that triggered your awakening of your mental health, which is no different from mine. And and I'm not going to give you my autograph unless you want to trade autographs, which case, that'd be okay. And she just laughed and she said, no, point taken. But even Sid, he would never do that. People would ask him for his autograph and he wouldn't do that. He just would say, no, I'm just Sid Banks. I'll be long gone, and this will still be a power in the world because it's human power, not Sid Banks power. And I don't know that the awareness of the natural humility that arises from seeing the health in everybody is always focused on in this work anymore. That was, it was so obvious when Sid was here because he lived it. He just looked at people and saw something beautiful in every single person. He saw the life in them. He saw the light in their eyes. He saw the joy in their spirit. He saw, beyond the surface of their behavior and thinking in the moment. And he treated everybody with the same level of respect and kindness. But he wasn't a sucker, he was shrewd and he did business very well. But he never did it disrespectfully. And I have so many clients. I have, because for years before I was in my early 40s when this happened. So, when I got really involved in it. And so I had a half a lifetime, a half a work lifetime of being a different person. And I was pretty hardcore. I didn't mess around in business. I was very competitive. I was, as a woman, I had to fight my way to where I was trying to go in life, because especially back in those days, we were not very badly respected, if respected at all. Women weren't even supposed to work. And so I was tough. I have to say it. I was tough, and I had integrity, and I was honest, but I was aggressive, and I was tough, and I worked my fanny off, and I was kind of a take no prisoners person. And I had a lot of feminist friends, and they were very shocked when I got involved in the principles, because I just couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't see it that way. And they would say, well, but this isn't right, and we've got to march, and we've got to do this, and we've got to do that. And I go, well, yeah, there's a better way to do it. And they go, no, you gotta, what's wrong with you? Where's your passion? Where's your spirit? And I said, it's not that. It's that when you see the innocence in people, it's really hard to be mad at them. It's really hard to blame them for things. It's really hard to say, well, this guy's in my way and he's creating this problem, or he's, people were angry at politicians, and they're angry at the county commission. They're angry at big businesses. And I'm thinking, like, why are we so mad all the time? It doesn't make sense to me anymore. And that's kind of that change in me. It was very profound, and it was really from observation of Sid and the people around him, was Elsie and Chip and Jan, and George and Linda Pransky were fairly new to it. Bill was new to it. Chris Heath. There weren't that many of us, And but we all sort of had that same experience of just like, no, that's, you don't want to have all this negativity going on everywhere. It doesn't make sense. And so among us, there was very little friction ever. So that was one of the reasons why the merry band of original people could stick together and keep going, because we didn't disagree about much, and if we did, we got over it and worked it out. And and it wasn't ever about the details. It was about looking for the vision, following our hearts, which was very different from anything I'd ever known before, but it was much more comfortable. So I remember one time when I was in Salt Spring, and Sid, I forget who was with us. There were 3 or 4 of us, and it might have been Roger Mills and Clyde T. and maybe George and Linda. But we were having lunch in this restaurant in Salt Spring. It was pretty. It was on the water, and it was just a pretty day. And we were just sitting there eating lunch on the terrace on the deck at the restaurant, and there was a waitress waiting on us who was quite distressed. I mean, you could tell that she was distracted, and she had a lot going on in her head, and she was like, dropping things and, rushing around, and kind of, you could tell that she was really frantic. And I remember Sid said, "Poor thing." He said, "Let's be extra nice to her because she's having a bad day." And Sid started talking to her. And he talked to her, just like a regular conversation. He said, Stop for a minute, dearie. Thank you. You're taking really good care of us. Thank you very much. But I just wondered, I hadn't seen you here before. Are you new here? Did you just start work? Or, I'm not here that often, but I just wondered." And she said, "No, I've been working here about a month." And she started talking to us. And he said, "Well, you're doing a really good job. And I want to thank you for taking such good care of us and let you know that we're very appreciative." And she started to cry. And he said, "Oh no," he said, I don't mean to upset you." She said, "No, it doesn't upset me." But she said, "Nobody ever says anything nice to me." She said, "I try really hard. I really want to do good at this job. And it's, I need this job and I want to keep it. But I always feel like people don't like me, and that I'm not doing it well enough." And he said, "Oh, don't think about that." It's just what he said. "Oh, don't think about that." He said, "Just think about what a beautiful place this is, and the food is good, and people enjoy it, and we appreciate your service." He said, "Sometimes people are busy, they're talking, they're distracted, and maybe they don't take a moment to say something, but I'm sure they really appreciate it." Well, I could see her change for the rest of the time that we were there. She was moving slower. She was smiling at her customers. She started chatting a little bit with people. She wasn't so tense and frantic. Now that's not therapy, but it is. It's healing. Every interaction. What I learned from Sid is that every interaction that we have with other people is either a healing interaction or it isn't. And if it isn't, shame on us. Now Sid was a human being and he had moments, but he was always sorry afterwards. If he got upset and with somebody, within moments he'd get over it and he'd say, I'm really sorry, I was just in a mood." And he never let it go. He never acted like it didn't happen or tried to pretend that he hadn't hurt your feelings or whatever. He just took responsibility and did the right thing, which turns out to be very easy to do. So I think the two, that's one part about Sid, is the fact that this is very simple and it's heartfelt, and it speaks to the beauty in all people at rest. If your mind is at rest, we have much more in common when all of us are at peace than we do when all of us are upset and thinking our own individualized rolling thoughts. And when people's minds quiet down, they find common ground very quickly. I'm sorry that the world doesn't see that so clearly, because so much of relationships, especially international relationships, and are based on, who can yell the loudest, who's got the biggest gun, who's got the biggest weapon, who's got the, the most ships or whatever. But, it's really the people that make a difference in the world are the people that bring peace and quiet into an understanding, and people calm down and suddenly they discover what they have in common. And I know that's true because one of the things that happened to me, well, I'll tell you, Sid came to Bradenton not long after I started working with Bill, and I had no thoughts of doing this work at that time. I was running a company and I was happy doing what I was doing, but our whole company had started to change, from just our association with Bill's practice. And one of the things that happened for me is that I realized that consulting was really messed up. That being a consultant was a it was a bad idea, you know. and there, I mean, I was part of an industry and I had this realization, I just can't do it this way anymore, because I would get upset because we would do these evaluations of medical practices. We were very good at it, and we would go in and we would look at all the aspects of the business of the practice, not the actual practice of medicine. That was the doctor's purview, but how the office was run, who was running it, what the patient flow was, the demographic, all this stuff. And then we would write an analysis of the areas of strength and weakness, and what a series of recommendations of what the practice could do to improve cash flow or improve patient satisfaction or whatever they were trying to fix. And people, we would present we called them practice evaluations. We would present practice evaluations at meetings, and and the doctors always loved them. They would sit in the meeting and they go, yeah, you're so right. I never noticed that. This is great. It was great stuff. Thank you so much. They had no problem writing the check. They were happy to pay us. They were pleased with the product. They never did it. And the rest of our business was 3 months later, I would check in with them and say, how's it going? How are you doing with the recommendations? Is everything working out? And they would say, no, we just, we've been busy. We haven't gotten around to it. We're too stressed, we're blah, blah, blah. And then they would either hire us to do it for them, or they would not. They would thank us and move on. Well, what a terrible thing, to make people dependent on you. And it was like, I suddenly realized that is so bad. That is wrong. I mean, I remember I told Sid this story, and Sid just laughed his head off. I said, I just thought, this is so wrong. It's immoral. It's just, these people are doctors, for God's sake. They're, they know what they're doing. They're not stupid. They don't need some idiot to come in from the outside to fix things for them. They just need to calm down and see their way, see their own way, see what they want to do. And I just said, I can't do my business this way anymore. And I remember, because he said, well, then don't do it some other way. And I'm going like, I have no idea what other way that would be, because this is what I know how to do. And he said, well, obviously you're not going to do it, so you better figure it out. So anyway, I remember we lived on the water, and we were out in a boat one day, and in Florida, you almost have no choice. If you're on the coast, you're living on the water. And we were out on our boat, and I was just sitting on the boat looking around, and I suddenly had the realization that I was treating problems as though they were real, instead of treating the state of mind that created the problems, because they look different when people calm down. Like, the doctor's problems didn't seem that hard to me because it wasn't my problem. I was like, it wasn't going to affect my income if they didn't solve their problem. It wasn't food on their table, not mine. And so it was easy for me to be neutral and look at their situation, and perfectly obvious what to do, to me, what I would do if I were them, but I'm not them. And why would they do what I think they should do? Because they're not in the state of mind that would support that. It wouldn't make sense to them. And I just realized that. And so I changed my whole business model um, overnight. I mean, I just called my staff together and I said, okay, we're going to stop doing what we've been doing. We're going to do it different. And they were like, oh no, here she goes again. But, you know, it worked, because what happened is our practice became, our relationship with our clients became collegial rather than hierarchical, if that makes sense. Instead of we're the experts and you're the goofuses that don't know how to run your practice, you know, it became we're here to help and you have ideas and we're going to help your ideas come to fruition. It was a whole different experience. And they stopped being so suspicious and angry, and they looked forward to our meetings, and and actually resulted in more business for us because they had a lot of ideas. They just didn't know how to execute them, or they were too busy. They might know how, but they were too busy. But when they didn't feel threatened by the idea that some expert was going to come in and manipulate their whole practice, when they could say, well, this is how we want to do it, this is what we want to do, this is our dream, what do you think? And then we would come in as kind of commentators, you know, well, yeah, that's a good idea, and we could make it work this way, and how about this? And we'd have these conversations, and we got a lot of business out of that because they were actually doing things, whereas before they were just leaving the reports on the shelf and doing nothing. And you know, it was very successful. And I remember I was telling Sid about that, and he said, well, that's good, that's good, I'm glad it worked out. It's like he wasn't surprised at all, you know. He was like, he didn't care either. It was like his interest in business was pretty minimal. So, and that wasn't what I think wasn't what I was hoping I would do. But what I started to do more and more was to turn over to my staff. I had 47 people working for me, turn over to my staff all the business of practice management. And I started working on state of mind with my doctors, because I realized that they were stressed and they were unhappy, and they were struggling with a lot of the same things that I struggled with before. And so I kind of had a little sub thing going where I would come in and do retreats and management meetings about strategy and things like that to help them to see the role of state of mind in their practice. And then I started realizing this is really what I want to do in life. So ultimately, I sold my business and I moved to La Conner and went to work with the Pranskys in La Conner, because that was the center of the universe at the time. You know, it was like it was Hawaii, Minneapolis, and La Conner, and Sid lived in Salt Spring, was very close to La Conner and came there a lot. So it was kind of where you wanted to be. So, and after I moved to La Conner, I saw a lot more of Sid because he often visited, and we often went to Salt Spring also to visit him. And people would come, you know, we would take clients up there and things like that. And the one thing that was so important to all of us at that time was that our contact with Sid was never, I mean, I don't think we spent a tenth of the time we spent with Sid talking about the principles. That's just not what we talked about. We talked about life. And underneath that, you know, the fundamental truth of the principles was always the guiding, um, I guess, the guiding light of the conversation. You know, we talked about things that we could do, or things that we could do with other people, or things that we could do for people, or ways in which we could change the world. We had a pretty big agenda of changing the world, and obviously we didn't succeed, but hey, we tried. Um, there were too few of us and too big of a world, and it'll happen eventually. Critical mass will be reached, but Sid would talk about ordinary things, just like talking to that waitress, the example I gave you of just speaking kindly and saying what came to his heart, you know, that the poor thing, she just is insecure and it's making her work hard for her. But he didn't sit and give her a big lecture about insecurity and the principles. And if you understood the principles, you wouldn't be so insecure. You know, I think one of the mistakes that gets made as people get involved in this work is that because it's important for us who do the work to understand where it came from and what the principles are and what they mean. But it doesn't mean that every time we talk to somebody, we have to explain it to them. And in a healing encounter with somebody, if we're coming from that space where we're talking to the health in that person, when we're looking at that person, what we're seeing in them is their health. And we're speaking from our own hearts, from our own wisdom, from whatever inspiration we have in the moment as to what makes sense, it'll help. And yeah, I mean, they can at some point, you know, people, if they come to us for help and they get help, they're going to say, well, how did you know to say that? Or why, where did that come from? Or, and then you can, it comes up naturally. It's like people used to freak out in the beginning. We all freaked out about talking about mind, you know, because I think partially because most of us didn't really understand it at first, but also um, it just seems so airy fairy. You know, how can we talk about mind? It's like, you know, it's like I remember sitting. George talked one time. He says like a fish trying to describe the tank. You know, it's like we're in it and of it, but we have no idea what it is. You know, and and Sid was you know, he didn't have too much patience with that. He said, well, you know, look deeper inside yourself until you see what you want to say, you know, say it in your own words, say what comes to mind for you, say what looks true to you, speak your truth. And, you know, we all thought we had to sound like Sid in the beginning. I guess that's normal, but, you know, we think, oh, well, you know, what would, you know, so it's like, you know, all those used to wear those bracelets that would say, what would Jesus say? We would go around, what would Sid say, you know, in this situation? Not that we thought he was Jesus or anything, but, you know, it was just the same kind of thing. And that was foolish. And Sid would say, don't try to say what I say, because if somebody asks you a question, you don't know what I would have said next. You got to say what you say so you'll know what to say next. It's common sense, right? And he was very frustrated with people who were trying to out Sid, you know, kind of. He was just an ordinary guy. I guess the best I can say is that he was not ordinary, but he was in real life. Like my daughter and I went up there one time to visit him in Salt Spring, and the ferry was actually right across from the driveway. It was a long driveway up to his house. It was right near where the ferry lets off. So we got off the ferry and just drove up to Sid's house, and he was out mowing his lawn, you know, and he had on a pair of shorts and he was shirtless and he had on a gold chain, and he was, you know, which he used to wear a gold chain back in the day. Everybody did. And he was out there sweating, mowing his lawn. And he said, oh, go on inside, kids, you know, just get yourself some tea or something. I'll be in a minute. And, you know, it's like Sid Banks was just a regular person living a regular life, maintaining his home. He loved doing projects around the house. He was very handy as a welder. You know, he knew how to do a lot of crafts and things, and he built his own fireplace. He was really proud of that. You know, the fireplace he built was gorgeous. So he was always doing little chores around the house. You know, he loved walking his dog in the woods. He was just a guy. And if you met Sid, you would say, yeah, he works in a factory. He looks just like all the other guys that work in the factory, and he lives like they do too. And you'd never pick him out as, you know, somebody who'd had this major epiphany and was going to, you know, transform psychology and psychiatry. But that's the same person who would show up. Like we went to speak to physicists. I don't know, Bill may have told you the story of that, but he went to speak to a group of physicists one time at MIT. And he was going to speak to them for a couple of hours. And I think that the person who invited him, who was somebody that knew him very well through George, thought, well, it'll be good for them because they're pretty stressed out and they're big thinkers and they kind of lost sight of the spiritual side of life. And he ended up being there for 2 days, not continually, but he was there for a few hours, and they said, well, are you leaving tonight? And he said, no. And they said, well, will you come back tomorrow morning? And then will you come back this afternoon? And he spent hours with them because they saw that he knew something that they were trying to figure out, which is what's the underlying truth in the universe. And that's what the whole direction of physics is, to find the unifying principle. If you've ever read Stephen Hawking, that was the whole point, was to find the unifying principle of the universe. And they saw that he knew it. He just couldn't talk about it in physics, but they saw it, and they wanted to see what they could get from him. They were hungry, is the way our friend who took Sid there put it, that they were just hungry to hear him long enough to grasp what they were missing that he could see. That's amazing when you think about it. That's amazing. But he was talking to them just like he talked to all of us, just about regular things. But he did mention that he thought that the theory of relativity had a mistake in it. It was kind of interesting. And it's interesting only because he feels that what Sid said was, what he got out of listening to them was that they didn't understand that formless means nothing. So when somebody says, like he would say something like, well, all right, so we're sitting in a room and we all know that the room is air. The space that's not filled with matter is air. Now, is air formless or a form? And they would say, oh, it's formless. And he'd say, no, it's not. Air is made up of molecules. It's hydrogen and oxygen. And they couldn't grasp it. Just because they couldn't see it didn't mean it wasn't a form. And that when he's talking about formlessness, he's talking about nothing there, no form, energy, pure energy. And when physics thinks about energy, it's still got, like electricity or gas or energy of some sort. It's a form. And he honestly, he laughed when I remember after he had had that experience. He really liked them. He was very touched at how respectful they were, and that he had these wonderful conversations with them. But he said, gosh, they're so hung up on this form thing. And I said, well, the problem is that they work in mathematical and algorithms and mathematical equations, and they don't know what to do with formless. You can't write it down, So it's a different kind of discovery. It's very interesting. But he was never different. He talked to them just the same way he talked to us. Simple words, simple truth from his heart. And if he didn't know something, he said, I don't know. And he wasn't ashamed of that. He didn't feel like he was supposed to have the answers to everything in the universe. He just knew what he knew so far. And the other thing is, the focus of Sid was to tell people, look at me. I'm an orphan. I grew up in poverty in Scotland. I have no idea who my real parents are. My actual parents who raised me weren't even that nice to me. I had a tough childhood. I joined the British Army. I became a welder. I worked in a factory my whole life until this experience. It could happen to anybody, so don't make me special. He would say, don't make me special. I'm like an ordinary guy. I don't even know who I am, really. It's like, I don't know where I came from. I don't know what my family of origin is. All I know is I had this 3-day experience, which I never asked for. I wasn't looking for it. It happened. And after that happened, I saw something that seemed so obvious. I don't know why everybody doesn't see it. So he wanted it to be very clear. And you got to remember that back in the days when Sid was first talking to people, that was Ram Dass, all these big time gurus that were out there in the world. The Beatles were going to India to sit with Ram Dass, and there were a lot of cults and a lot of cult figures and a lot of people who were making a lot of money off other people saying that they knew truth about life. And Sid had no use for any of that. He didn't want any part of that. And if people started treating him that way, he would run away. He actually left Salt Spring and lived in Hawaii for several years because people were making pilgrimages to Salt Spring to see him, because they kind of put him in that category of, some new guru. And he didn't want any part of that. So he just disappeared. He took his family and moved to Hawaii, and only a handful of people knew where he was. He had a few friends there, and that was it. And he wrote, that's where he wrote Second Chance and started on In Quest of the Pearl. But he didn't come back to the States until people had almost forgotten him, because he just didn't want any of that. And that's important, because, we make a big thing about the importance of respecting Sid as the primary source, because he is the primary source of our understanding of the principles, and because he wrote 6 books and made tapes and left us, in his own words, everything he could say about it. And you'll notice he says the same thing 50 different ways. It's very simple. And so it's like, I'm an academic, I know that if you want to know something, if you want to know about Einstein, you don't read 5 books about Einstein, you read Einstein's papers. And, if you want to know about Sydney Banks, you don't, read 17 books about Sydney Banks, you read Sydney Banks books first. And then you read the books about him and decide which ones are additive and which ones are crap, and some of them are, to be honest with you, not Natasha's, but some of them are, but you'll notice when Natasha and Dickon wrote the book, what did they do? They started with Sid and they talked about it. And the reason that we do that is not because we're trying to make him into a cult figure or make him into some big deal in it, or, build statues to him or anything. We don't want any of that. It's because he is the person who saw what he saw and took the time to write it down and leave it for other people in his own words, as in plain English, plain language. It's not hard. It's like when I minored in philosophy in college, and I remember sometimes reading these books, and I particularly remember Wittgenstein, reading this book, and I'm going like, oh my God, I cannot understand. Like, every other sentence in this book is so dense, I cannot grasp it. And I'm not stupid. This is ridiculous. And then I get to the end of the section on Wittgenstein after reading his book, and then, reading other things that they had given us to read. It turned out he turned against his own work, like 4 years after he wrote the book. And I was like, well, why did they make me read this book? But Sid doesn't fall into that category. So he doesn't want his name, wouldn't mean anything to him whether we mentioned his name or not, but would mean a lot to him to know that people were looking to his work, to his legacy, for the truth about the principles, for the simplicity of it. So I should stop, really. I'm sorry I've gone on, and see if you have further questions, or if anybody wants to add something. Or Natasha, I'm sorry I haven't kind of precluded questions here.
Oh, it's just been wonderful to listen. I mean, I love how you started with Bill, and the insight you had into how he saw people as mentally healthy.
Yeah.
And then that kind of caught your curiosity, and then it went on, and you met Sid, and there was this ordinariness, and there's just seeing people as healthy, and seeing the light in their eyes, and the life in them. I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah.
I also love how you said that, this is not about teaching the principles. It's just about being a kind person, being ordinary, treating people with kindness.
And see, when you know the principles, that's your proof, sort of the logic behind why everybody's okay no matter what they're doing. It's like, as soon as you understand how thought works, you realize that it doesn't matter what a person is doing in the moment, what nutty thing they're doing. It's nothing to do with who they really are. And you're always talking to who they really are.
Yeah.
And as soon as you do talk to who they really are, it wakes up. I'm sure you all have that experience, when you do that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think, one of the things that I experience that people love about, hanging out in these communities, especially at places like London, for instance, when
Yeah.
both virtually, but especially when we go there, is that the feeling
Mhm.
between people is so much kindness. It,
Yeah.
and do you remember sometimes they talk about the vendors outside that are selling the food and the coffee? They're like, what's going on in there? Everybody's kind to me. Everybody's
Yeah.
smiling and happy and hugging. I want to go in and hear what's up.
Yeah, now wouldn't it be nice if that was the world we lived in?
Oh, yeah.
And you see, that is the world, because see, we're random people. We're just random strangers who
Yeah.
came together and found something.
Yeah.
So any other random people could do the same thing at any moment. And, that's my hope, is that over time, more and more people get involved in this, that they will touch the lives of more and more people. And at some point, we will reach a point where humanity starts asking itself, why are we fighting?
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had invited you for this hour, and it's already up, and I know that I'm sure that there would be lots of wonderful things that people would ask you, but I would say to them, please go and look at your website, and also we've posted your website on our page, and
Yeah.
there's lots of wonderful videos, and you show up in conferences. You're going to show up in my program in a couple of weeks.
I'm so excited about your
Yeah,
program.
me too.
I love what you're doing. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So.
Well, I should also say that if there's a burning thing that you really want to ask, why don't you email it to Natasha? She can email it to me. I answer emails when
Yeah,
people have questions. If there's something that you didn't get to ask because I hogged up the whole hour, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I wasn't watching the clock. So,
oh, it's wonderful, just perfect. Thank you so much, Judith, for coming, and
well, thank you.
I'm really grateful that you're here with the Danish community, and yeah,
Well, I'm very, very proud of your community. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I wish you all joy and happiness, and spread the love.
we sure will. Thank you
Okay,
so much, Judy. See you
you're
soon.
welcome. Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.